Red, good evening. Infidel.
Also, I wanted to tell you, islamophobia is a made-up word that nobody had ever heard of until 20 years ago. And it is designed to intimidate people into thinking there's something wrong with opposing jihad terrorism and Sharia oppression of women and others. It's a word meant to intimidate you into silence. So you can't let it. But one way you can try to embarrass them is to focus on non-Muslim victims of persecution by Muslims acting in the name of Islam and in accord with its teachings in places like Pakistan and Nigeria. All the victims, they ain't white. And they are suffering because of Islamic principles. Now, is it racist to stand for them? And when you talk about feminism and about women and women's rights, I have a whole list at my website, Jihad Watch, that I publish every now and again whenever there's a new story. But you can find it by searching, of all these women, as many as I could find, who were threatened, brutalized, and sometimes, in some cases, even killed for not wearing the hijab. So, can you stand with those women? You know, in other words, you try to show up their hypocrisy, that they say that they're not racist, but they don't stand with brown victims of jihad terrorism. And they say that they're feminist, but they don't stand with women who were brutalized by Islamic teachings, and show up their contradictions. In Afghanistan, 99% of the people are Muslim. Islam, as you have no doubt learned, is one of the world's great religions, and many, many people hold to it. Many people hold to it very, very fervently, and many people don't. It's just like any other religion in that regard. Some people take it very seriously, and some do not. Just like with Christians, there's some Christians who know the Bible backward and forward, and pray all the time and go to church, and there are others who say, well, yes, I'm a Christian, but they don't do any of these things. The problem is that in the case of Islam, you're talking about a religion that teaches warfare against unbelievers and the necessity for the believers to conquer non-Muslim communities and subjugate them under the rule of the Muslims and Islamic law. Now, this is a widely controverted point, and you've heard everybody say Islam is a religion of peace. Probably your teachers have told you this as well. But the unpleasant fact is that there are so many terrorists, there's so many terrorist groups that are Islamic, not just the Taliban, but Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, so many others. Pretty much everywhere around the world, there are jihad terror groups. And this is because this kind of violence against non-believers actually has support within the Islamic teachings. So if you're the average Afghan and you go to school, you're going to learn that it is part of the responsibility of your religion that you should wage war against unbelievers. Now, you know, because you go to school, that not everything a teacher says is something you're just absolutely going to do. And when you go to college, that becomes very important to bear in mind. However, at the same time, there are some people who take seriously what they're taught. I have instructed all these groups in the military and the FBI about terrorism, and that's true. What I would do is, I would go in and teach the FBI agents about the mindset of the terrorists. What is the terrorist thinking? What does he want to accomplish? What's important to him? What's not important to him? And go through the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and the teachings of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, to show what they were thinking about. Now, the average person that we have brought over here was taught that. And there's more. They were taught other things as well. Take, for example, a recent news item that in Missoula, Montana. Anybody here from Montana? No Montanans? Oh, hello. Well, right in Missoula, Montana, there was an Afghan refugee who just came to the United States, and he was accused of rape. Now, rape is a very unpleasant subject, and you can say, well, they're rapists of all cultures, all beliefs, all societies, everything. That is true. But there is a particular aspect to this that has not been remarked upon. And it was the same thing also at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. In Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, there were 2 Afghan refugees who just arrived who were arrested, one for sexual abuse of a minor, a child, and the other for spousal abuse. So we have 3 cases now. Now, the wild card in all these cases that nobody in the establishment media will tell you is that those guys almost certainly did not realize they were doing anything wrong. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, says in chapter 33, verse 59, that women should cover themselves. You've seen the pictures, I'm sure, of women in Afghanistan, and they're completely covered in a burqa, it's called. It's just got a grill that they can see through, but otherwise, they are completely featureless, and you have no idea what they look like, and that is how they go out in the world. Other areas of the Islamic world are not as strict, and you can see a woman's face and hands, but that may be it in many areas. Iran has jailed women for up to 10 years for not wearing the hijab, the head covering. It's a very important thing. And chapter 33, verse 59 of the Quran says that women should veil themselves so that they are not molested. Now, that sounds like a reasonable thing, that you want to protect yourself from rapacious people by doing this. But the idea is that it is the woman's responsibility to make sure that men are not tempted. It is not the responsibility of a man to control himself. It is the responsibility of women to make sure that they do by removing any source of temptation by covering themselves completely. And then the unspoken corollary of that verse in the Quran is that if you don't cover yourself as a woman, then you may end up getting molested, and it would be your fault because you didn't cover. And it is widely known, you may even have heard, that in many areas of the world, including Afghanistan, but by no means limited to Afghanistan, both men and women are taught that a woman who goes out uncovered is essentially like a prostitute. And if you were to walk down the street, like dressed the way you are, every woman in this room, in Kabul, in Afghanistan, then you would very likely be physically attacked by people who thought that it was their perfect right to do so because you have it coming because you didn't cover yourself. And it's all your fault. So, guy ends up like that with these kinds of things in his head. He goes to Missoula, Montana, and he starts talking to a woman who is not covered because people don't wear burqas in Missoula, Montana yet. And he thinks this is somebody who is cheap, no problem. And he just assumes this. This is the cultural frame of reference that he was brought up with. It's not his fault in a certain sense. Obviously, the rape is his fault. But I'm sure he was shocked when he was arrested. And it's the same thing with the 2 in Fort McCoy. One of them was arrested for abuse of a minor. Now, in Islam, there's the Prophet Muhammad. You may have heard of him. When he was 51 years old, he married a 6-year-old girl. Yeah, this is in the Islamic texts. It's well attested in what are called the Hadith, the reports of Muhammad's words and deeds, and specifically the Hadith collection that Muslims consider to be most reliable, the one that will give you the straight dope about what Muhammad said and did, Sahih Bukhari, and it's in there many times. And the multiple attestation, the repetition of it, is an indication of authenticity as far as Islamic theology goes. So he's 51 years old. He marries the 6-year-old. It specifically says that he waited until she grew up a little bit. They consummated the marriage when she was 9 and he was 54. And he lived with her and his other wives until he died when she was 18. Her name was Aisha, and she has become very famous nowadays because of the fact that the Quran says, chapter 33, verse 21, you can open your Qurans right now and look it up. Chapter 33, verse 21 says that Muhammad is the excellent example. Full stop. It doesn't say excellent example when he does this or that, but excellent example, period. So see, anything Muhammad does is good. And if you imitate it, then you're good. That's basically Islamic behavior. The code of Islamic behavior right there. So if Muhammad married the 6-year-old and consummated the marriage when she was 9, then you can. So in 2003, the United States forces actually toppled the Taliban from power, the same Taliban that is now back in power. And in 2003, there were aid workers who went into refugee camps where there were people who had been dislocated by the war, and they found that half the girls of 2nd grade age were already married, and all the girls 3rd grade and up were married. Every last one. That's what, 10 years old, 9 years old? It's Muhammad. It's his example. So a guy comes over here, he's in Fort McCoy, and he sees a child, and he doesn't think there's anything wrong with this. This is Muhammad's example. It's the same thing with spousal abuse. The Quran says, chapter 4, verse 34, you can check my work. The Quran says, good women are obedient. And as for those from whom you fear disobedience, notice that it says, those from whom you fear disobedience. So you see, if you're married and your wife, she's, looking at you funny maybe, and you think maybe tomorrow she's going to disobey me, you can beat her today. Because it says, as for those from whom you fear disobedience, 1, give them a warning, 2, send them to separate beds, and 3, beat them. This is the Quran, the holy book of Islam. It's the perfect word of Allah transmitted through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, the enduring, perfect guide for human behavior at all times, all places, all nations, and all cultures. And it says that if you fear disobedience from a woman, beat her. So this guy is beating his wife at Fort McCoy, and he gets arrested. Once again, I'm sure that he was absolutely shocked. He had not been apprised of the fact that this kind of thing is not taken for granted in the United States. But the larger picture, the implications of these 3 incidents are very serious. We don't know who these people are. They're coming from a jihad terror hotspot. And you can say, yeah, well, Spencer, not everybody in Afghanistan is the Taliban. Right, some of them are ISIS. The fact is that virtually everyone in Afghanistan believes that it is important to wage war against unbelievers. They come here to a land full of unbelievers. It would be, the surprise would not be if one of them turned out to be a terrorist, or more than one. The surprise would be if one of them didn't turn out to be a terrorist, because there's more. There's always more. We had an air base in Afghanistan, Bagram Air Base. It was a key center for American military operations while we were in Afghanistan. The Biden administration, in yet another genius move, one night during the summer, they left. The Afghan National Army, our ostensible allies, the ones that were fighting the Taliban, they went to Bagram that day because they had a lot to deal with the American forces there, and some of them were being trained and so on, and everybody was gone, and the place was empty. The United States left the air base, completely abandoned it, fully equipped, and didn't even tell our allies that we were leaving. This is a bonehead move in so many ways. It would take the rest of our time and more to go through it. But the point here is that on that base was a prison, and that prison held thousands, literally thousands, of ISIS and Al-Qaeda members. And the Taliban came in not long after we abandoned the base, and they opened the gates of the prison and let them all out. Not long after that, there were There was the crush of people at the Kabul airport that you may have seen on the news. All these people trying to get onto airplanes to get to the United States. Now, imagine if you were there and you're trying to get to the American airplanes, and there's a huge line and people rushing and hanging onto the wheels and everything. And who do you think are the most likely people to have been able to get on those planes? But the strongest, the toughest, and the most ruthless people. Because they would be able to fight their way through the line and beat everybody else back and get on. And who are those but maybe guys who belong to ISIS and Al-Qaeda? There's another aspect to this too. Chapter 4, verse 100 of the Quran promises great rewards to those who emigrate for the cause of Allah. Emigrate, leave one place and move to another. Now, that might seem to be a strange thing, but it's very important. Because the Quran will tell you, you can see it in chapter 21, verse 47. You die, you're going to stand before the judgment of Allah. And Allah's going to have these big scales. And on the scale, one scale will be your good deeds, and on the other scale will be your bad deeds. And if the good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you'll go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you're going to hell. Now, imagine if you believed that. It would drive you crazy. Or maybe I shouldn't be presumptuous. I'll just say it would drive me crazy. Because how do you know? How many good deeds have you committed? How many bad deeds have you committed? How much does each one weigh? There are no answers to those questions. And so you're looking at all eternity in hell, and hell is very lavishly described in the Quran. Your body will get burned up by the flames, and Allah will issue you a new one so you can get burned up some more. And He'll make you drink molten lead, and all sorts of terrible things will happen. And it just never ends. So if you take this seriously and you think this is the word of God that is unalterable and perfect, then you're deeply afraid of hell. So the Quran promises paradise to those who emigrate, promises great rewards, But it actually promises paradise to those who kill and are killed, which is why we see suicide bombers. That's chapter 9, verse 111. But in chapter 4, verse 100, it says that a great reward is given to those who emigrate in the cause of Allah. Now, emigrating in the cause of Allah doesn't just mean moving to a new place. It means moving to a new place to try to Islamize it. So you have Islamic law, which is a political as well as a religious system, and which denies the freedom of speech, denies the equality of rights of women, is virulently anti-Semitic, denies all manner of things that we take for granted in the United States. And you have an unknowable number of people now in the United States who are likely dedicated to bringing that here. Make America Afghanistan. And they'll get great rewards from Allah for doing it. So what's the downside? The downside is that the Biden administration has set up the United States for a future full of strife on a number of levels. You got 95,000 people. That's an immense amount of trouble that can be caused. Remember, it was only 19 hijackers on 9/11 who killed 3,000 people. If you have even just 2 or 3 terror cells in there, which you very may well have, then you could see thousands of people being killed. If that doesn't happen, and we can all hope and pray that it doesn't, there's still the cultural and societal disruption caused by people who think beating women is just fine, or that rape is just fine, or that sexual abuse of a minor is just fine, because this was what they were raised to believe. And the people who are supposed to be training them to become Americans are too cowed by the whole idea of multiculturalism. The whole idea that we have to respect all cultures and all cultures are equal and so on. You ever heard that? They can't tell them this is wrong. They can't behave that way. That would be Islamophobic. So it's going to be a rough few years, very likely, as these new populations are being integrated into the United States. And then you got to wonder, what on earth are these people thinking? If thinking and Biden can go together at all.
Do you see any similarities between the Islamic Jihad and the Christian Crusades? And what should we say to those people who try and justify the jihad?
There's no similarity whatsoever, although you're quite right. The connection is very glibly made, and I often actually see Islamic jihadis referred to as crusaders. And even people like Bill Clinton, who ought to know better, he said after 9/11, you know, all this started with the Crusades. And it wasn't true. It was never true. The reality is that in the 7th century, Islamic armies began to conquer, came out of Arabia, Arab armies at first. Islam came a little later. You can read about that in my book, Did Muhammad Exist? But that's another story. In the 7th century, North Africa, the Middle East, Iran, parts of India were conquered. By 100 years after the traditional date for Muhammad's death in 632, that is, by 732, there was an Islamic empire stretching from Spain to India, all the way across North Africa, the Middle East, Iran, and so on. Most of that had been Christian land before that. Iran was Zoroastrian, but North Africa was Christian, Egypt was Christian, well, that is North Africa, the Middle East was Christian, and all that half of the Christian world was conquered and Islamized. Now, this is in the 700s, mind you, starting in the 600s, actually. 1095, the First Crusade is called by Pope Urban II. That's 450 years later. The Crusaders, at the height of the Crusades, controlled the Holy Land, or what is now Israel and Lebanon, essentially. They never made any attempt to win back anything in North Africa or any other area of the Middle East. And by 200 years after the establishment of those Crusader territories in the Middle East, they were gone. They lasted just about 200 years. Now, the Crusades, in other words, in short, were a late and small-scale defensive action to defend the Christians in the Holy Land after 450 years of Islamic jihad that had been unanswered. And half the Christian world destroyed and Islamized. What we think of now as the heart of the Islamic world was the heart of the Christian world. So the idea that the Crusades and Islamic jihad are somehow equivalent is based on ignorance of history. The people who say it to you and to others are banking on you not knowing the real facts, and on propagandistic claims that have no basis in reality, that this was some sort of a proto-imperialist movement to colonize the Middle East. There were attempts to colonize the Middle East out of Europe, but they came hundreds of years after the Crusades. And the Crusades have nothing to do with that. So they're just, once again, banking on people not knowing. And the reality is that also that the Crusades have been repudiated by every major Christian group, and there hasn't been one for 800 years, whereas the Islamic Jihad is still very much with us and continues to this day. In the first place, yes, there are moderate Muslims, but there is no moderate Islam. This is a distinction that many people seem to have trouble grasping, but it's really very simple. And that is, there are Muslims who are never going to blow you up. And they're never going to do anything criminal. And they're wonderful folks. And they are Muslims. There are other Muslims who will blow you up, or worse. And the difference is that, and this is where it becomes very politically incorrect and unpleasant, but nonetheless, the jihadis are generally quite devout and knowledgeable. But as I said at the beginning of the talk, there are many people who are neither devout nor knowledgeable, or some combination of the two in Islam, just as in everything else. And so they're Muslims, but they don't take it so seriously as to act upon the teachings exhorting jihad violence. But those teachings exist. All the sects, you mentioned the Sunnis and the Shiites, and there are all sorts of other groups. The Wahhabis are not a sect of that kind. They're a Sunni subsect, but they're all kinds of different groups, and they all teach warfare against unbelievers. Does that mean every Muslim takes that seriously? No, but it is there. So there are moderate Muslims, but there is no moderate Islam. Because there's no moderate Islam, you don't see a huge moderate Muslim movement. Have you ever noticed, for example, there have been demonstrations against cartoons of Muhammad because you draw Muhammad, this is very offensive in Sunni Islam. 800,000 people in Chechnya, hundreds of thousands of people in Pakistan, same thing, Indonesia and elsewhere. Massive demonstrations. When have you ever seen a massive demonstration of Muslims against jihad terrorism, against Al-Qaeda, against ISIS and all that? I'm not saying that there aren't Muslims who do that, who do oppose all those things. But there was a Muslims Against Terrorism rally in Washington, D.C. a few years back. It got massive international publicity, and 50 people showed up, and most of them were not Muslims. Same thing. I track these things all the time at Jihad Watch, and every Muslims Against Terrorism rally has drawn 25 people, 50 people. I've never heard of one over 100. Now, why do they not come out for that? Because Islam does teach warfare and violence. And so if they stand up and say, I'm against warfare and violence, I think we should coexist peacefully, then they're saying that they're not loyal Muslims as far as the jihadis are concerned, and then they could be killed for heresy or apostasy. So there are moderate Muslims. A lot of them are deceivers. That is the spokesman, not your average guy. But a lot of the people who portray themselves as moderate spokesmen, and then they say, you know, properly understood, the Quran teaches peace. Well, it doesn't really. You can get the Critical Quran, my Guide to the Quran, coming out very soon. Mr. Brandon's supply chain crisis has delayed it, but it should be out before the end of the year. The Critical Quran goes through every passage of the Quran and explains how it is understood in mainstream Islam. And the book does say these things. Kill them wherever you find them. That's 3 times in there. And these things are not, very clearly, not some historical reference for some isolated group, but open-ended universal commands for all the believers. Here again, they don't all do it, but it is all in there. So I don't think it's a good idea to rely on moderate Muslims to try to do this. And it's also very hard to... Another thing, very briefly, is that the British government has been doing that for years, and they keep finding that the moderate Muslims they're working with are actually jihadis who are deceiving them. And so that's another hazard, because Muhammad said war is deceit. So it's very difficult.
So what are your thoughts on Israel-Palestine? I know that's a bit of a broad question, but
that's all right.
Your general thoughts.
That's an important question, because this area is so clouded over with misinformation and disinformation. And you need to understand that a lot of the things that you will hear is misinformation and disinformation. And then you can ask, and it's a completely reasonable question, well, Spencer, how do we know you're telling the truth? Well, that's why I gave you the citations of the Quran. You can check my work. You should check up on everything that I have said, and you will find it all to be true. Now, the thing about the Israeli-Palestine conflict or Palestinian conflict is that a lot of people support the Palestinians because they have been told that Israel is being unjust and is being unnecessarily harsh in dealing with them. That there are terrorists, but there's been collective punishment and innocent people being targeted and so on. Now, the reality is that the Palestinians, even the United Nations, which is very anti-Israel, even the United Nations has upbraided, scolded, noted that Hamas, the Palestinian terror group, actually uses human shields. That is, they plant their attacks in civilian areas. Like if you have a school and little kids going to school, 3rd grade or something, they'll fire a rocket from the playground into Israel. then the Israelis will see, oh, the coordinates are that the rocket was fired from this place, so let's take out that rocket launcher. And so they hit the playground. That's the idea, that they will kill all these kids. And then the Palestinian propagandists will say, look, they killed all these children. You see how brutal they are? Actually, Israel is the most careful army in the entire world, also in world history, to avoid civilian casualties. They actually notify people in Gaza before they're going to bomb an area so that everybody can get out. Because what they target are Hamas installations, Hamas offices, Hamas launching centers, and so on. And they tell people, we're going to bomb this place in 3 hours. You should clear the area. And there's even a recording, you can probably find it online, where there is an Israeli commander and he calls up this guy in Gaza and he says, we're about to bomb your building because it's a Hamas headquarters. Get all your people out of there and get especially the children, because there's a little school, little kids right there. And the guy says, we want them to die. We want them to die so that the world will see how evil you are. So who's evil? You see, the fact is that if you've studied 9/11 at all, September 11th, 2001, Islamic jihadis trained in Afghanistan came to the United States and murdered nearly 3,000 people with attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and there was a third plane as well. They held to exactly the same ideology that the Palestinians hold, the same beliefs, the same goals. And part of what they believe is that no non-Muslim state, no non-Muslim country has any right to exist, nor do Muslim countries that don't obey Islamic law. And they have to be destroyed and a country set up according to Islamic law put in its place. So the Israelis face this every day, and it's exactly the same thing that hit us on 9/11. The idea that somebody could be against jihad terrorism and in favor of the Palestinians shows that they don't really understand what the Palestinians are all about. Because remember the words of Thomas More. If you don't know who Thomas More is, look him up. The devil is a proud spirit who cannot endure to be mocked. Bear that in mind. That's what drives them crazy the most. But it's a rich field.